topic for tonight is the question of whether or not a ben Noach, a bat Noach can observe Shabbat. I think that people have Shabbatophobia, and I understand it because this is a very complex issue, and it occurs in the exact same place in the Talmud where we saw the prohibition against Torah study. It's really one passage, and I'll give you a new vocabulary word. The word is sugya. A sugya is a passage in the Talmud. Sometimes it could be really of any length, but the point is that it's a self-contained section. So the halachot, the laws with regard to Shabbat and Torah study follow right on each other's backs. It's in the same sugya. Now, I think the first thing I'd like to do is just talk about the holiness of Shabbat. Get a sense of that. This is not in the source sheets. If you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, it says the following: the heaven and the earth were finished, and all their array, all their host. On the seventh day, God finished the work that he had undertaken. God ceased on the seventh day from doing any of the work, and God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, having ceased on it from all the work of creation that God had done. So if you notice, Shabbat occurs sort of in a vacuum. No one's there to observe it. When Jews make a blessing to commemorate a holiday, like Passover or Sukkot, they say, Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmani. Blessed are you, Hashem, who sanctifies Israel and the festivals. And the word Israel is placed before festivals because the festivals are a unique meeting point between the Jewish people and Hashem. Festivals are actually even called Moadim, which means meeting times. If you don't have the Jewish people participating in them, they become kind of meaningless, because that's what it's supposed to be. But when we say the blessing for Shabbat, it's just simply Mekadesh HaShabbat. Blessed are you, Hashem, who sanctifies the Shabbat. Before any human being was called to commemorate Shabbat, Hashem sanctified it, which means that Shabbat is holy in and of itself, whether or not anyone observes it. And that's simply because Hashem himself declared it to be holy. And nobody has to show up for a Shabbat to be holy. But we have to understand what the unique relationship of B'nai Israel to Shabbat is. And this actually comes from this week's Parsha, Kitisa. And it always, by the way, it always works out like that. It always works out that the exact topic that you're talking about is something that you're going over right now. I don't know if anybody else has had that kind of experience of synchronicity like that, but I see it all the time. And it was funny because in a way we had spoken about the idea of this being a weekly shiur, and I thought after the one on Torah study, I said, great, let's do this again next week. I couldn't do it for good reasons, but it turned out that the material itself coordinates with this week's parsha and would not have coordinated with last week's parsha. Let's look at source number 1. This is from Exodus 31:13. And you speak to the children of Israel, saying, nevertheless, you will guard my Sabbaths, for it's a sign between me and your children for your generations, to know that I, Hashem, have sanctified you. Once Hashem gave Shabbat to the Jewish people, he told them that they are to stop all productive work. Now, a very important term, I say productive work. The Hebrew word for productive work is melacha. Very often people hear that Jews can't perform any work on Shabbat, or let's say be involved in any activity that looks like work. But the fact is that it's not a prohibition against activity. It's a prohibition against a type of work that is creative, that is generative, and that we would consider productive. Okay, so this even includes the building of the Mishkan or the temple on Shabbat. And you can ask the question, what could be more important than completing the building of the Beit HaMikdash, a dwelling place for Hashem? And yet the holiness of Shabbat eclipses even that. So let's look at the next Rashi, which is source number 3. Okay, Shabbat is a unique sign. It's a covenant between Hashem and the Jewish people. As Rashi explains, he allowed them to inherit his rest. When Jews observe the Shabbat, they're like the moon reflecting the light of the sun. It's like a mirror of the day that he rested, which then allows for a raising of consciousness about him in the world. Until the laws concerning Shabbat were given to the Jewish people, there was no obligatory observance of it. No one observed Shabbat because they had to. So it's a very important thing to understand that something very unique has happened here. That there has been a group of people that has been designated to follow in Hashem's footsteps, as it were, to mirror his cessation of work. So that's the holiness of Shabbat when it pertains to Bnei Israel. Now let's talk about the prohibition on Sabbath observance for Gentiles. The source for that prohibition is in Tractate Sanhedrin on page 58b, and that's source number 4. Reish Lakish says a non-Jew who observes Shabbat is liable to the death penalty, as the verse states in Genesis 8:22, and day and night they will not rest. It's a very unusual use of that verse. Mars said their prohibition is their death. I have to explain what that means. Usually in the system of 613 mitzvot, there's one verse that gives the warning and another that describes the punishment. You usually have the two things located in separate containers. When it comes to Sheva mitzvot, there's only one verse that contains the warning. And as we know, the death penalty is the standard punishment for transgression of any Noahide laws, meaning to say of the 7. Outside of the 7, not. Okay, so that's just to explain Mars' statement, which seems a little bit disjointed in its place. And the Gemara continues. Ravina said, the above is true, even if he made the second day of the week Shabbat. Okay, so we have two statements. We have Reish Lakish, who gives us the prohibition, and we have Ravina, who either is arguing on Reish Lakish or is elaborating on what Reish Lakish said. We'll have to see. And the Rishonim read this passage in different ways. But now let's go back into the Gemara. The Gemara raises an objection. Says, if so, that a non-Jew is liable to the death penalty for keeping Shabbat, it should have been counted amongst the 7 mitzvot. And this is an objection that we saw with regard to Torah study as well. There is nowhere in the 7 mitzvot where there's a prohibition against keeping Shabbat. So if you're going to come up with a death penalty, you have to show that somehow it is in the 7 mitzvot. Okay, so the resolution of this objection is that the 7 mitzvot only include negative commandments. Positive commandments are not included. We're going to have to understand what positive commandment is being articulated here. And we'll see that as we go. So first we have to understand the original context of Genesis 8, verse 22. It's a promise from God to humanity through Noah that he will not destroy the world again. He will not disrupt the functioning of the natural world. It says, day and night shall not cease, meaning the seasons will come and go in their normal cyclical fashion, and the normal world will be sustained. Now, Reish Lakish gives us a completely different understanding of this verse, which Rashi explained. Look at here we're going to launch into Rashi's concept of how this sugya goes. And this is an idea of a complete prohibition on any form of rest. And Rashi tells us that the verse that states day and night will not cease is referring to a period that includes both day and night. So we're talking about a full 24-hour period. Question is, how do we get from here to a capital offense if non-Jews observe the Sabbath? And the answer to that is through the proposition of Reish Lakish. Rashi understands this passage as going beyond a simple prohibition against non-Jews observing the Sabbath, meaning keeping the laws of the Sabbath. The verse says, Yom v'layla lo yishbotu. Day and night shall not cease. The word is yishbotu. Yishbotu means will not cease. Now, the simple reading of the verse is that it refers to the natural world. But Reish Lakish implies that the they in the phrase they will not cease is actually referring to any human being who has not been commanded to observe Shabbat. Such a person is simply not allowed to cease from productive labor. And Rashi says that if a non-Jew refrains from doing his work for a full 24 hours, he's committed a capital offense. So far, so good. Now, in the next source, which is the next comment, Rashi turns the heat up all the way. Look at source number 5. The first thing that Rashi clarifies here is that the statement of Reish Lakish is not about a non-Jew who observes a Sabbath out of some perceived religious obligation like Shabbat, or like the Christian Sabbath, which takes place on Sunday. In fact, it's not about Shabbat at all. Rashi understands the Gemara to mean that no type of rest is permitted whatsoever. This basically means not a vacation, not even a day off. Going back to Breshit, the book of Genesis, we do not find any commandment to keep Shabbat. It's not one of the 7 mitzvot. The only one who we see explicitly observing Shabbat in the book of Genesis is Hashem himself. For on the 7th day, he rested from his labors. And it's important to understand that even if you aren't commanded to observe Shabbat, Shabbat still remains a reality of the world. That still is the day that God rested. It has holiness. It is special in and of itself, no matter who observes it. But there's no specific commandment to change one's behavior because of it until the commandment was given. And then it was only given to B'nai Israel. What Reish Lakish is saying, according to Rashi's understanding, is that not only do non-Jews not have a specific mitzvah to observe Shabbat, they have a specific commandment not to refrain from labor for any 24-hour period of time. Now we can understand the next part of the Gemara, because the same objection is raised about this law as was raised concerning the prohibition on Torah study. We know there's 7 mitzvot. Now you, Reish Lakish, are saying that there's another prohibition that's punished as a capital offense. If that's true, then there's 8 Noahide laws. And the Gemara resolves this question by explaining that the list of 7 mitzvot are only what are called Shev v'al taseh laws. Okay, the phrase Shev v'al taseh means sit and do not do, meaning refrain. And that's how Chazal refer to negative commandments. The phrase is Shev v'al taseh. The Gemara is telling us here is that what we call the Sheva mitzvot is not the entire list of Noahide laws. It's only a list of the prohibitions. The other category of Torah laws is called kum ve'aseh, which means get up and do. And that's the way Chazal refer to positive commandments. According to our Gemara, none of the positive mitzvot that Noahides are required to perform are listed amongst the Sheva mitzvot, only the prohibitions. So sidebar, the Torah life of B'nai Noach extends way past the Sheva mitzvah. How does the Gemara view this prohibition against Sabbath observance? Not as a prohibition per se. The verse, again, says, Lo yishbotu, they will not cease. And the proposition here is that we apply this to people. But it's the other side of a coin. The main point here is that there is a positive mitzvah to maintain a life of productivity. It's a kum v'aseh that happens to be phrased negatively. Lo yishbotu, do not cease. But it's nevertheless a positive mitzvah. And that's why it's not listed amongst the Sheva mitzvah. We have another example of this, actually. When you think about the mitzvah, it's one of the 613, of V'ahavta l're'acha kamocha, you shall love your friend as yourself. When that mitzvah is translated or interpreted, for example, by Hillel, he says, De'alach saneh, al tavid l'chavrach. Whatever is hateful to you, don't do to somebody else. What do we see from that? That you could have something that is phrased positively, but it's actually a negative commandment. To refrain from causing harm, from causing distress to somebody else. So here too, you'll have this phrase, lo yishbotu, they shall not cease, but it's nevertheless a positive mitzvah to continue doing something productive. So at first glance, seems a bit unfair. No rest? What's the mitzvah to keep working? If you're going to tell me that all non-Jews have to go out in a pair of overalls and a construction helmet with a T-square like Bob the Builder, I mean, that's not what's being said. So let's look at this from 10,000 feet. We have to zoom out. What's the meaning of work? It doesn't mean to just make stuff or flip hamburgers. Adam HaRishon was given the responsibility to care for, to protect, and to develop the world. That was his avodat Hashem. That was the way he was going to serve God. We, as his descendants, carry the torch, and it's up to us to bring the world to the vision Hashem has. Work is a medium through which human beings exercise their creative capacity in the service of Hashem. When we work, we produce, we create, we contribute. Without a cease work order from Hashem in the form of a commandment to keep Shabbat, what right would anyone have to take a day off from their contribution to the development of Hashem's world? So according to Rashi, this is not a it's not a discriminatory law prohibiting so-called heathens from putting their dirty paws on the holy Shabbos. It's a holy imperative to carry on the work of creation until the world reaches its tikkun. Now let's get back to the specific phrasing of Rabbi. Okay, he said that even if a non-Jew makes Yom Sheni b'Shabbat, the second day of Shabbat, this is how we refer to the week. Sunday is Yom Rishon, Shabbat, and then Monday is Yom Sheni Shabbat. We think the 7-day period of time, we call that, we will refer to the entire 7 days as a Shabbat. Just like we will sometimes refer to a year as a Shabbat when it comes to the Shemitah year, for example. So Yom Sheni b'Shabbat is Monday. Why does he specifically pick Monday and not Sunday? Why does Ravina specifically pick Monday but not Sunday? Think about when the Gemara was finally codified. It was codified at the end of the 5th century. So for at least 500 years, you've had people commemorating Shabbat on Sunday. And since the Council of Nicaea in 325, okay, so you've had at least 175 years where Christianity is a state religion. So Ravina is picking the 2nd day of Shabbat. He's picking Monday because that is the first day which has not been designated by anybody as a Shabbat. Now, if we look at source number 6, the Torah Tamima has a very interesting take on Rashi's approach. The Torah Tamima was written by Rabbi Baruch Halevi Epstein, who was born in Novardok in what is today Belarus in 1860. And he studied at the famous Volozhin Yeshiva and was a student of the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. You might have come across his name or his acronym. The Torah Tamima was a bookkeeper by profession, but nevertheless managed to produce a series of very well-regarded and scholarly works. We would expect that because he was also the son of Michael Epstein, who was the Rav in Novardok and produced the Sefer Orach HaShulchan, which at one point in time used to be the main halachic work studied by people, particularly in America. He died in Pinsk in 1941 of natural causes while the city was under Nazi occupation. So he explains that the opinion of Reish Lakish is based on a passage actually in Midrash Rabbah. Rabbi Eliezer says that both the constellations and the natural world in general actually continued to function during the flood. If we go with that idea, then the fact that Lo Yishbotu actually refers to human beings is not a second line type of homiletics. It's not a boutique understanding of the verse. It's the primary explanation of the verse, right? Think about it. If it's true that no change in the natural universe occurred during the flood, then Lo Yishbotu can't possibly mean day and night or the seasons. It must mean people. So, human beings, unless they've been commanded to observe Shabbat, are being asked to participate in the regularity of the natural world. And then he points out that the verse that says, 6 days shall you work, okay? This is a commandment to the Bnei Israel. 6 days shall you work, and you shall complete all of your productive work. God has designated 6 days of the week for work, where we have to complete everything. One of the main things to understand about any Torah text is that there are no extra words. Whatever's in there is what Hashem wanted to be there. So why does the verse say, work 6 days, and then it says, complete all of your productive tasks, which is essentially just repeating the same thing. When you see in Torah text anything that looks like a repetition, you have to know that the second time around, it means something different. Well, there is a Mishnah in Avot de Rabbi Natan, which is a version of Pirkei Avot, where it explains that melacha, that's the word again, that refers to productive work, is actually an additional concept than just work. And there it says that if a person, this is the example it gives, if a person owns a courtyard or a field, and that property is lying in ruins, he should go out, work it, and restore it. He should not leave it desolate. And this goes in two different directions. Yes, we should be all dedicating our energies to perfecting the world and cultivating it and making it a peaceful, kind, and nurturing environment and a comfortable place for Hashem to dwell. But the Torah Tamim also cites a verse that says, "Great is work, for it gives life to its owner." What's he saying? He's saying that being productive is of value in and of itself. There are a million studies, and we're probably familiar with them, about what happens to people when they retire, but don't find a way to meaningfully engage with life after they've retired. Question is, what's the difference between B'nai Yisrael and B'nai Noach on this point? Logically, the problem of idleness and the need for meaningful engagement with life applies to all human beings. Work is something that is not just about pushing a pencil. It's about being called to a task. It's about being responsible. It's about being accountable. It's about knowing that you're the one who's qualified to do this, that you have a unique mission here, a unique purpose. So that's something that is really universal. Why are we speaking of this only in terms of B'nai Noach? So the Torah Tamim explains that while Jews can theoretically occupy their time fully with Torah study and prayer, let's say on a rest day, non-Jews could complete their learning more easily and in less time. After all, the Sheva Mitzvot is a much more compact system. So therefore, to live meaningfully, B'nai Noach have no other option than to direct their focus to productive endeavors. What we see here is that a person who has been commanded to observe Shabbat serves Hashem by refraining from melacha on that day, while a person who has been commanded to remain productive serves Hashem by performing melacha on that day. That's his mitzvah. So that's Rashi. That's our first model. And it's not about Shabbat. It's about a kind of an imperative to participate on a constant and consistent basis in the development and cultivation of the world. Now let's look at the Rambam's understanding of this passage, which you can find in source number 7. This is concept number 2. The Rambam's problem with non-Jews commemorating Shabbat is that it might have the effect of creating a new religion. If you look in the Rambam, you'll notice that the Rambam doesn't even mention the source text that was brought by Reish Lakish. And it could be that he sees in the phrase lo yishbotu a specific reference to Shabbat, because after all, the word yishbotu is made up of the same 3-letter Hebrew root as the word Shabbat. Perhaps lo yishbotu, according to Rambam, is only about Shabbat. Lo yishbotu means they will not keep Shabbat. And that will flow very nicely with the phrasing of Reish Lakish. Clearly, the Rambam does not extend it to mean just like any form of rest, the way Rashi did. A non-Jew can take a day off, They can take a vacation. They can retire if they want to, which should be a big relief to some of you people, because some of you take a lot of vacations. They just can't observe Shabbat. Not on Shabbat itself, nor on any other day. Because they can't invent mitzvot for themselves. And they cannot create new religions. We don't allow that. It seems kind of imperious to say it like that. We don't allow them to create a new religion. If we actually sat, in the seat of government somewhere. But the point is, it's not supposed to happen. Okay. So that's the Rambam's approach. The Rambam's approach is meant to stave off the possibility that a non-Jew will invent for himself a religion. There's only one religion, and it is the religion of Torah. We call it Judaism. Torah observance is the only religion. There's not supposed to be another religion created once the Torah was given. So we need to do what we can to prevent that from happening. That's the Rambam's approach. We still have to understand what happened to the death penalty mentioned by Reish Lakish. He does mention a death penalty in the sense that we don't execute a person who does this. That's incredible. Here we have a Rishon taking a piece from the Gemara and seemingly contradicting it. If you remember our Shiur in Torah Narrative and Law, where we gave a bit of a timeline of the development of Torah, one thing I have to add in to our understanding of that is that there is a descending chain of authority that runs through that timeline, which means that let's say, for example, the Mishnah, the rabbis of the Mishnah are called Tanaim. A rabbi of the Mishnah is called a Tana. A rabbi in the Gemara is called an Amora. An Amora cannot argue on a Tana. A Tana has inherently more authority than an Amora does. An Amora has more authority than the Rabbanan Savarai, who have more authority than the Geonim, who had more authority than the Rishonim. Okay, so who ultimately have more authority than the Achronim. So we always have to be looking back and basing ourselves on some prior authority. So here we have the Rambam saying that we do not execute a non-Jew who observes Shabbat. I mean, he might be liable to the death penalty, but we don't do it. We have to understand what happened over there. And for that, we're going to need the Lechem Mishnah in source number 8. I'll give you some background. The Lechem Mishnah was authored by Rabbi Avraham de Burton, who lived in Salonika, in Eretz Israel, and in Constantinople during the 16th century. And he's one of the primary commentaries on the Mishnah Torah. What he's saying is that the Rambam's opinion is that, you'll probably remember this from the Shiur on abortion in Noahide law. We said what the Gemara said over there. Late midam the Yisrael mutar v'akum asor. There's nothing permitted to a Jew that's forbidden to a non-Jew. A system of 613 mitzvot should always be more stringent than a system of 7. So it shouldn't be that there is something forbidden to Noahides and permitted to Jews. Although we saw that abortion does not carry the death penalty for Jews, where it does carry the death penalty for non-Jews. So what happened over there? That was a very, very big conversation. Lechem Mishnah is saying that the idea that there's nothing permitted to a Jew that's forbidden to a non-Jew applies even in cases where Jews have been given a mitzvah to do something non-Jews have not, such as Torah study and Shabbat, where there are actually prohibitions involved. And note, the Rambam states explicitly that if a non-Jew learns Torah or observes Shabbat, again, he's not executed, which contradicts the simple language of the Gemara. And there are several explanations for this. One is that in this sugya about Shabbat, about Torah study, where it says chayav mita, that person is liable to the death penalty, it's what we might call a rabbinic death penalty. Why do we call it that? Because the Ben Noach is only liable to lethal punishment for transgressing the actual Sheva mitzvot. And the Sheva mitzvot are all biblical commandments. But essentially, what the Lechem Mishnah is saying that it's just logical. If it's not only permitted, it's mitzvah for a Jew, it should not be prohibited to a non-Jew. And even where there are tighter parameters for a non-Jew, it can't be enough to actually make him liable to an actual death penalty. Let that sink in. And that contradicts what we saw in Tosfot during that shiur. So that's Rashi and Rambam. Two models so far. One, seizing upon the verse of Lo Yishbotu to give us the idea that rest of any kind is forbidden to non-Jews. So obviously Shabbat doesn't get off the ground. And the Rambam, whose concern is that a new religion would be created. Now, let's look at the Yad Ramah. Model number 3, source number 9. The Yad Ramah is Rabbi Meir Halevi Abulafia, and he was one of the Rishonim. One of the most prominent rabbis and rabbinic judges in Spain during the 13th century. And he was actually a major opponent of the Rambam for theological reasons. I don't know how much you know about that, but the Rambam had faced tremendous opposition to the point where, to the point of book burnings. It's a very tragic story. We'll tell it at a different point in time. The Yad Ramah wrote an enormous compendium on the entire Talmud, which was called Pirtei Pratim. But only a few volumes of the original work survived. And one of these is his commentary on Tractate Sanhedrin. So often when people are learning Tractate Sanhedrin in a yeshiva, they will use the Yad Ramah. Okay, so when he's explaining his own take on the passage, the Yad Ramah reiterates Rashi in stating that the misunderstanding of Reish Lakish, not Reish Lakish's misunderstanding, but a misunderstanding of his viewpoint, is to think that Reish Lakish was referring to a non-Jew who's keeping a Sabbath out of a sense of obligation, that's where the prohibition applies. And he cites 2, possibly 3 examples of such a person. Arabs who rest on Friday for some type of idolatrous reason. And these are obviously not Muslim Arabs. And then a non-Jew who rests on the Jewish Sabbath. And in another version of the Yad Ramah, Christians who rest on Sunday. All 3 cases are of people creating a religion of their own. So, for the Yad Ramah, there are 3 possibilities for why Shabbat observance is prohibited. When it is done in the name of idolatry, such as the people who rest on Friday. Idolatry, as we know, is one of the 7 mitzvot. The second case of a person resting on the Jewish Sabbath essentially is committing theft, which is another one of the seven mitzvot. In this case, theft of what Rashi referred to as a nachala, right? That's another word that means inheritance. Shabbat is an inheritance that's exclusive to the Jewish people. So if somebody else would like to come along and observe Shabbat, we spoke about the concept of cultural appropriation last time in the Shiur on Torah study, and it's similar. It's basically identical with regard to Shabbat. That's the second problem. And the third problem that the Yad Ramah points out is the problem of being mechadesh dat, which is the unauthorized creation of a new religion, like Rambam. Now, the Yad Ramah takes this further and says that if a non-Jew takes a day off on any of the random non-sabbatical days of the week, it will appear that he is already keeping a type of Shabbat, and that's prohibited. He's not saying what Rashi said, which is that this prohibition applies to any cessation of productive work by Gentiles. He is saying that it's punishable because the mere appearance of Sabbath observance, the appearance of establishing a new religion, is a problem. A non-Jew should not take a day off. Why? Because he'll give the impression of creating a new Sabbath or a new religion for himself. And essentially, it's a social problem. And the Yad Ramah distinguishes his understanding from that of the Rambam that we saw earlier, and notes that for the Rambam, it's not enough for a non-Jew to give the impression of creating a Shabbat or a new religion for the penalty to apply to him. He's not going to be liable for appearing to create a religion, appearing to create a Shabbat. He must actually be establishing a new type of Sabbath. He has to actually create a new religion. Rest alone is not an issue for the Rambam. So that's the Yad Ramah. That's the third model that we're seeing. Much more sensitive understanding of the problem of appearing to create a religion. We have an interesting sort of parallel in Jewish law. Very often, if you're driving for long periods of time, you need to use the restroom. And the only places that'll let you do that are restaurants or fast food places along the road, almost all of which are not kosher. So it's customary for a Jewish male, at least, to remove his kippah before he goes into a place like that, because we have an idea of marit ayin, meaning to say that other Jews who are required to observe laws of kashrut are going to see this Jew going into a non-kosher establishment, and they're going to get confused by that. So the appearance, in other words, we take off the kippah. It wouldn't really make a difference if I took mine off, because I'd still look like this. But there are some people who have who can pass more easily. The appearance of patronizing a non-kosher establishment is a problem, right, for a Jew. So that's what the Yad Ramah is basically saying. The very appearance of observing Shabbat, when it's spoken about so stringently in the Gemara, is a problem. Now, we've seen an opponent of the Rambam, that's the Yad Ramah. Let's have the opinion of Rabbi Menachem Meiri, who was a very big proponent of the Rambam. Rabbi Menachem Meiri is also known as simply the Meiri. He was born in Perpignan in the Pyrenees region, and he was the author of an enormous commentary on the Talmud, which is called Beit HaBechira. Beit HaBechira refers to the temple. meaning to say that if the temple is also referred to as Beit HaBechira, meaning the place that Hashem chooses to cause his presence to dwell. And it's a bit of a play on words, because Beit HaBechira, it's Bechira because he's Bocher, he chooses which passages in the Talmud to delve into and to explain, very often leaving aside the more narrative portions that you find in the Gemara. And it's a gigantic work. It's an absolutely encyclopedic work, which was rediscovered in 1920 at the Biblioteca Palatina in Parma after being lost for centuries. There's also legends about the Meiri that he was allowed to see the basement of the Vatican, where they kept the items from the temple that had been stolen by the Romans during the wars, and that there was a piece of the parochet, the curtain that hung or was laid over the Aron, that it still had dried blood from having been sprinkled on it from sacrifices. I don't know if the legend is true, but I've always wondered what's in the basement over there. According to the Meiri, any discriminatory statements made about non-Jews in the Talmud only apply to actual idol worshippers of the ancient world, not Gentiles in the general sense. So that's also a perspective that the Meiri is known for. So let's look at source number 10. The Meiri, this is concept number 4 with regard to Shabbat observance. The Meiri is concerned with creating a new religion, becoming an influencer, and then speaks extensively about permission to observe other mitzvot. Non-Jews are allowed to observe other mitzvot. Basically, the Meiri is saying that the same thing as the Rambam, which is that if a non-Jew wants to keep Shabbat or learn the entire Torah, he should take upon himself the yoke of the 613 mitzvot. In other words, he should convert. This is what Rambam said, and this is what the Meiri is saying as well, that, listen, you know what? You want to keep Shabbat? Doors open. You can take upon yourself the yoke of all 613 mitzvot if you want to be obligated in the observance of Shabbat. So stop pretending to be a Jew and be one for real if that's what you want. Convert. Also, the Meiri was concerned, which we see in his language, that if a person like that, let's say you have a person, because again, this is one sugya about Shabbat and Torah study. Let's say you have somebody who keeps Shabbat perfectly and learns Torah to the utmost. The concern is that this person could become a thought leader, as we say in social media, and can lead people astray because he appears to be so authentic, so authoritative. And this is similar to the Yad Ramah in a way that, in terms of it being a social problem. But the Meiri also says, well, he brings a statement from the Gemara, if you remember in the Shiur on Torah study, that the opinion of Rabbi Meir was that he's like the Kohen Gadol. He's like the high priest, a non-Jew who studies Torah. And the resolution over there was that, yes, when his Torah study involves the Sheva Mitzvot, if a non-Jewish person is staying in his lane, and he's deeply engaged with his own Sheva Mitzvot, we honor him like a Kohen Gadol, a high priest. Now, the Meiri also adds that he can keep any other mitzvot that he wants to. And maybe this is a good thing. Perhaps he'll find this so inspiring that he'll convert. Rambam didn't say that Well, he didn't say that in the passage that we cited before, but if you look at source number 11, which is also in Hilchot Melachim, chapter 10, halacha 9, we have the following statement: the Ben Noach, who wants to perform any of the other mitzvot of the Torah, besides Torah study and Shabbat observance, in order to be rewarded for his devotions. He's doing it because he would like to be rewarded for it. He wants to give something to Hashem. We do not prevent him from doing them in accordance with their halachot. He can keep the mitzvot, and he can keep them completely, with all their details. And if he brings an elevation offering, we accept it from him. A non-Jew is certainly allowed to bring an olah offering to the Beit HaMikdash. If he gives tzedakah, we accept it from him, which we don't always from specific types of non-Jews. It's one of the things that the Kohen Gadol prays for on Yom Kippur is that the people within Klal Yisrael do not become dependent on each other and not dependent on other nations. But when it comes to a Ben Noach's tzedakah, we accept it from him. And the Rambam says, it seems to me, that we would even distribute it to the poor of Israel. Generally, what would happen if tzedakah was given would be that we would distribute it to the non-Jewish poor. The Jews would act as the middlemen, so to speak, to make sure that the charity reaches its recipients. Now, if we look at the next source, this is taken from the Chassam Sofer, his commentary on Tractate Chulin. We see some amazing things. If you want to take a second to just read that, then do. It appears that the Chassam Sofer is relating to the concern that if a non-Jew observes Shabbat, he is creating a new religion with new mitzvot, something that both the Rambam and the Meiri have expressed concern about. The problem of being Mechadesh Dat, creating a new religion according to the Yad Ramah, is similar to the problem of Avodah Zarah. Right? Because again, we had the exact example of idolaters on Friday, and let's say people keeping a Jewish Sabbath on Shabbat and Christians on Sunday. According to the Yad Ramah, this is similar enough to the problem of Avodah Zarah that it can be counted in a way as a violation of one of the 7 basic Noahide laws. See, Avodah Zarah is an interesting phrase because we generally understand it to mean idolatry, but the actual words mean foreign worship, forms of worship that are foreign to Torah. Now, that means that we can look at this in a bit of a colloquial way. That if a person is doing something that the Torah does not command, it's a different religion. But what if the same idol worshiper decides that he wants to observe mitzvot? According to the Rambam, it's fine, as long as he does not consider himself to be obligated, as long as he's taking this on as a voluntary practice, it's fine. Just think about it. For a non-Jew to consider himself obligated in mitzvot outside of the framework of Noahide laws, and I'm not just speaking about the 7 Noahide laws, I'm speaking about the most expansive version of them. That assumption of obligation would be akin to creating a new religion. You don't have to change that much to create a new religion. just a few details makes it not Torah. So even if this idol worshiper was observing some exact parallel of Judaism, with all the same laws, it would be a new religion because it's part of the Torah that non-Jews are not obligated in the full 613 mitzvah, not without converting. But the Chassam Sofer also picks up on the Lechem Mishnah. If he's not obligated, he's also not forbidden. I think a lot of people tend to assume that since this is not an obligation upon them, it's off limits. It's completely forbidden to them. What we're learning here is that that's not the case. Again, an idolater may voluntarily observe any of the mitzvot besides Shabbat and Torah study. But here's where the Chassam Sofer takes this to a whole new level. Put your seatbelts on, because this is beyond anything we've seen before. What if we have a guarantee that this person is absolutely not an idolater, and that they have taken it upon themselves not to practice idolatry, not the idolatry of Friday, or the theological idolatry of Sunday, or let's say the new religion created by the person observing Shabbat on the Jewish Sabbath. If that's the case, at least two of the objections of the Yad Ramah fall away. Some Sofer says something absolutely mind-blowing here. The Gemara said, and the Rambam repeated it, that Akum Shavat, an idol worshiper who observes the Jewish Sabbath, is liable to the death penalty. But then we look at the other phrase, a ben Noach, who is absolutely, by a priori, in and of itself, a ben Noach is not an idolater. What does the Chassam Sofer say? Mutar lishbot. Mutar lishbot. He is allowed to keep Shabbat. Chassam Sofer is the foundational personality of what we refer to as Haredi Judaism today. We're not talking about somebody who's an outlier. This is absolutely mainstream authority in Judaism. Question, of course, we could ask the question, does the Chassam Sofer mean when he says mutar lishbot? Lishbot is to stop working, is to stop activity. And Shabbat is the cessation of that activity. Does he mean that literally, that he can actually keep Shabbat? Or does he mean it in the sense that Rashi meant it, which means literally rest, forms of rest? As Rashi says, menucha bi'alma, any form of rest. So, meaning to say he could take a day off, take a vacation. We don't know. But if we take the words of the Chassam Sofer at face value, it seems to appear that we have a completely different type of person. And that's exactly what he says in this piece here. That by using the term akum, which is an acronym for Oved Kochavim Umazalot, a worshiper of stars and constellations, clearly an idolater. By using that phrase, and then by using the phrase ben Noach, according to the Chassam Sofer, the Rambam distinguishes between the two. That there is a third type of person who is not Jewish, but is not Gentile in the classic sense. is somebody who has a connection to Hashem, a connection to Torah, is an observer of the 7 mitzvot. We give a much wider leniency to such a person, according to the Shalom-B'nei. So we have 4 models that we looked at with regard to the question of whether it is permitted or forbidden for a non-Jew to observe Shabbat. Can Noahides observe Shabbat? The Gemara said no. But no to whom? That's the question. And then brought the verse of Lo Yishbot 2 as the source text. And then we went on a 4-way trip. Rashi saying that Lo Yishbot 2 is not referring to Shabbat per se, but is referring to any form of rest. Then we had Rambam, whose concern was person imitating Jewish behavior might come to create a Shabbat for himself or a new religion. The Yad Ramah said that this is even more of a social contagion than we think it is, and that actually the prohibition might fit somewhere neatly into the Sheva Mitzvot, either idolatry or theft. Then we had the Meiri, who, first the Yad Ramah distinguished between his own opinion and the opinion of Rambam, who holds that simply looking like you're doing that is not the problem. Then we had the Meiri, who sort of took up a bunch of different pieces, right? His concern was that person will become a thought leader. That person will become an authoritative thought leader and will lead other people astray. But the Meiri also opened up the whole conversation about the fact that, with the exception of these 2 mitzvot, anybody's allowed, including an idol worshiper. We're not talking about a Ben Noach. We're talking about something that's completely off the charts. Even that person's allowed to choose for himself different spiritual practices from the Torah. So we learn as we say, al achat kama v'chama, meaning to say, all the more so would that apply to a Ben Noach, especially the way the Rambam looks at it, as we saw in the last piece, and the way that the Chassam Sofer understood that, where that the Rambam is actually distinguishing between a person who does not observe Sheva Mitzvot and a person who does. So, where does this leave us? Where does this leave us? Are we allowed to keep this thing? Are we not allowed to keep this thing? It appears that obligatory refraining from melacha for the full 24-hour, really 25-hour period of Shabbat is forbidden. And even though we don't necessarily apply Rashi's legal decision, there is a very strong philosophical case to be made for the idea that unless you have actually been given a stop work order from God, you're supposed to be involved in the continued cultivation of this world. So we're more likely to come to, we see that the majority of opinions tend to come down on the side of simple rest is not a problem. Pretending that you're obligated in Shabbat is a problem. Here's another interesting technicality. When does a Jewish day begin and when does a non-Jewish day begin? They don't begin at the same time. A Jewish day begins at sundown. and continues until the following sundown. A non-Jewish day begins at midnight. So here's something interesting. It's almost impossible for a non-Jew to observe Shabbat because the amount of mitzvot, halachot, details they're so numerous that it's hard. I would say it's hard for Jews to observe Shabbat. The Talmud refers to the laws of Shabbat as mountains that hang by a hair. So many places you could go wrong. So that it's very unlikely, if you have not spent several years going through the Gemara, the Rishonim, the Shulchan Aruch, the Achronim, that you are going to completely observe Shabbat. Here's another thing. If your day begins at midnight, let's say you work all day Friday until past sundown, you're not going to reach a 24-hour period where you've kept Shabbat. It's just not going to happen. It's a near impossibility. So what I wanted to say based on this is that people don't have to be afraid. You don't have to have Shabbatophobia. This is the day that Hashem rested. This is the day that Hashem brought the creation to its completion. It's a very, very special day. And you can commemorate this day with prayer, with meditation, with special meals with your family. You could go to synagogue if you live near one, if you want to hear the Torah read. You certainly do not have to be afraid to wish each other Shabbat Shalom. I see there's still a couple of holdouts on our chats like, have a nice week. Come on. Come on. This is your Hashem. And this is his holy day. As long as you do not refrain from productive activity for a 24-hour period of time, you're fine. It's just another opportunity to become more conscious of him and get closer to him. It's true that full Shabbat observance, full obligatory Shabbat observance, and full Torah learning, I mean to say that Torah learning of the entire Torah, these are where the restrictions are. And this is the spiritual boundary between the B'nai Noach and the B'nai Israel. There's no reason why we can't live in parallel around times that God himself established. So anytime any of you happen to be in Jerusalem, I want you to come to me for Shabbat. I want you to stay. I want you to experience. I'll make you flick a light on or something. Not really. But I mean, that's an open invitation.